Hi, Aaron. I'll start in a second. Actually, you know what? I think I'm going to start now, just so I get through everything. Um, you can't see it because it probably is backwards, but I have my to-do list here of the things we're going to cover. So I'm going to start with the interviews for Essay 3. Essay 3 is kind of like, it really is based on the interview. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about techniques for maybe getting the most out of the interviews. And I'm trying to give you guys comments on the interview questions so that you guys have kind of a sense of like, this is how I should ask a question or, whatever the case may be. There's a few simple rules and you may have read about a few of them and that sort of thing. But with the rules, I'd be careful, or with the interviews, I'd be careful about, or I'd consider where you're going to meet with people to talk with them, or if you're going to do it over the phone. Usually, like when people interview over the phone, it's a little bit harder to capture, I guess, detail and things like that. But it's also really hard to capture the person's like nonverbal cues, and the nonverbal cues can sometimes tell you more than the actual verbal cues. So it's something to think about. Sometimes it can't be helped. You have to talk to people on the phone, and I've had really good papers written by people who had interviewed over the phone. So it's not something I'd worry about, but it is something to consider. The interview questions should really be open-ended. They should always be open-ended questions, at least to start. Try to get your interview subject to relax and to talk. And so open-ended questions or asking them to describe something is a better way, maybe, to get them talking. In my face-to-face class, we talked about this, and this is just, I think, a good rule of thumb. Try to distinguish between questions that will give you detailed answers, like factual answers. This happened and this happened and this happened. I remember I saw this. I remember I saw that. Versus questions that are like, what do you think questions, abstract questions. So an abstract question is, would be, what would you do differently? Well, I guess I wouldn't do this or I wouldn't do that. That's an abstract question. And it's also, frankly, a pretty abstract answer. So those are things that can kind of, they'll make the interview a lot more productive, and that's important. Just for this paper, if your interview doesn't go well, the paper is harder to write. You have to do a lot more of the work. But if you have a good interview, things will come together a little bit easier. I recommend having 10 questions at least. You may not use them all. And also to be ready for follow-up questions. Like just little things like that will make a big difference if you're just kind of careful and you kind of think your way through things. But as you ask questions, listen to the answers, capture whatever it is that you need to capture from that answer, and also think about follow-up questions. Those are things that I think help. And they make it, there's no, like, nothing helps more than having a really great subject, though. Like, that's hard to make up for. Some people love to talk, and for this paper, the more they talk, the better. So the interview part is important, and preparing for the interview is really important too. We talked about this in my face-to-face class as a matter of just as a matter of I guess consideration for the person. Make sure you're ready in terms of understanding what you'll be asking them, and maybe knowing a little bit about the background beforehand if it's possible. Usually, like if it's grandma, grandpa, or something like that, most of the story already, and so you have the background. But if it's not someone you know well, and I've had a few students interview people they didn't know well, And so it's good to be prepared. Know something about what you'll be asking them about, and ask questions based on that. Um, Another thing from my board here. Um, you probably can't see that, but facts versus abstractions. And so in the interview and in writing the narrative, you're looking for more facts, but also some abstractions. The abstractions are like the what do you think questions. It's the answers to those questions. And so in the interview, and then in going back and reviewing your notes, you're looking at facts and details. You're looking at the story part, and the story that this person is telling you, as far as we're concerned, is factual. So the more they tell you about the story and what was happening and the people and describing the places where they were and the things they were thinking about and all of that makes for a better narrative. So I think the more you have, the better in that respect. So fact is what you're after. Lots of facts. Um, you can also find some of the facts, and you will use some facts in your research if you find that you need to do research on this topic, and most people do. That's another way to bring factual information in, but it's not the same as like that won't necessarily enhance the narrative the same way. Like if you're writing about World War II, you can do the research on World War II, or like if your grandma worked in one of those, or great grandma, I guess it would be, worked in a factory that made um, bullets or something like that during World War II, and you can research about the plant that made the bullets, but your grandmother's going to tell you what it was like to be there in the middle of it, and what life was like at that time, and that's what the narrative is really about. So, um, the structure of this essay is maybe something that is a lot simpler than the last two essays, in that there's going to be a beginning, middle, and end. There's going to be like the introduction's more of like it's sort of it's presenting um, the event more than anything else. It's telling us about like what was going on and who's this person that you interviewed. And so you give us a little background on, if it's about 9/11, you tell us just a little bit about 9/11 and about this person. The conclusion is kind of the what do you think part of the discussion. It's like, what do you think about X, Y, and Z? How do you feel about what happened? Should we have done something different? Those are the kinds of questions you want answered in the conclusion. But the bulk of this is the story. So the structure is simple. There's a beginning, which is kind of the background and the person, and telling a little bit about them. The story, which is the bulk of it, and then the end, which is kind of what it all means, that sort of thing. And there can be some of the um, there can be some of the what do you think questions. Those questions can be explored in the body of the narrative too. Like it doesn't necessarily have to be at the end, but certainly your part of the discussion, what you think, will be at the end. This, unlike previous um, essays, this essay will have dialogue, I hope. And so as you go through your interview, listen and try to like if the interview subject says something that's really just incredible, and you think, wow, I should use that, write it down and use it. It will work better if you can use their words once in a while. Not always, like you don't have to have real long quotes and lots of them. A lot of it will be your own, mostly paraphrasing, maybe a little bit of summary, but certainly a lot of paraphrasing. But if you can get some direct quotes from that person, it makes them kind of come alive a little bit more too, especially if you can sort of capture their voice. Um, so dialogue is going to be a part of this. And for each person, that kind of varies with each person. These papers will not be really, like, in so many ways, essays 1 and 2 seem so similar for each person. Like, they just, because they had the same basic parts. Um, with essay 3, you kind of follow the structure, but you also maybe follow your instinct a little bit too. If you feel like, oh, this would work well here, you kind of just go with it because you're probably on the right track. You know the person, you know the story better than most people do. So um, it might be better to just kind of follow your instinct. It's you know, writing narrative is not it's not really formula driven, and it shouldn't be. It's much more driven towards um, it's kind of driven towards what you think. It's kind of driven towards um, as a writer making choices, not necessarily having the choices made for you. Um, and usually with narrative, the choices are pretty evident. I think. I mean, most students seem to find their way through the narrative pretty easily. So structure, there should be a structure, but there's not going to be one that I'm going to go out of my way to define very, very clearly for you. The most common approach is to tell the story chronologically. So to start from literally the beginning and go literally to the end. So, and that's the one thing in the structure that's usually pretty consistent from one paper to the next. So, next up is description. Um, that's a pretty simple one for me. Uh, you will want to try to put the audience in the place. And if you think back to Blood Done Sign My Name, there's like a scene or there's a moment where um, Tyson describes what the woman who did the cooking for his family was making for dinner, and he goes into pretty good detail. Um, and that doesn't seem like a really important just like piece of description, but it actually is because it puts us in that moment, and it kind of makes everything come alive in a different way. He would kind of just be recalling a memory kind of blandly if you didn't throw that little bit of like we were having, you know, all this stuff for dinner and then list it all off and um, including dessert, and that actually works really well. That the Tyson approach, his approach to writing narrative, is a really useful one. So if you sort of want to get some more inspiration, I'd go back to that one. The other reading that we're going to have is LaDuff, which is Detroit: An American Autopsy, and that's LaDuff has much more of a voice. Like he's in what I've found is that students either have to write like the kind of the narrative that's more objective, and a little more. There's more of an attempt to write a story, I guess, in a traditional sense. That is Tyson and Blood Done Sign My Name, or they're trying to capture the voice of the person they're interviewing, and then it kind of turns into something more like LaDuff. So that's why I include both. And we'll have some discussions on LaDuff in the future, but his writing is very unique to him. He would not be mistaken for other people, whereas um, Tyson's style is much more kind of common, I guess. He's a pretty typical historiographer. Um, Description in this case then is really it's factual detail. And if you want to go beyond factual detail, you certainly could. But for most people, they want to get through this assignment, and they want to, they want to fundamentally um, tell a story. And so when you tell a story, one of the big things is, you don't leave out detail because that's what makes the story real. So like the table that people are reading at, if that's an important detail, you describe it. If, like the look on someone's face is important, you go out of your way to describe it. And I think you hope that your interview gives you some of the description, but realistically, the subject probably won't go into a lot of detail. And what I'd like to see is you as a writer make sure, like, try to describe something that you think is really, or several things that you think are really important in the story. So, um, and that's description. And we'll be talking about it in my face-to-face class tomorrow. But for all of you, well, I guess there's only two of you, but for those of you in my face-to-face class or my online class, there's actually a PowerPoint in week 9 that week 9 or week 10. I think it's week 9 that you'll want to take a look at. You can go through it pretty quickly. Actually, you don't need to go through every little bit of it, but it will give you an idea of what we're looking for with description. and then sources. And again, like there's no real answer to, I don't have a really concrete answer as to whether or not you're going to need multiple sources, one source, two sources, three sources. I don't know. I think you need to know your subject matter. And so if you need a source for that, that's what you should do. Um, but beyond that, most students usually have one or two, and then the interview. And those are the three sources they end up with. We'll be going over the works cited stuff on that in the coming weeks. But right now, the big focus is the interview itself. How do you go about that? So those are the main things that I wanted to go over and just cover briefly. Why don't you go ahead and ask any questions you have, if you have questions, and I'll go ahead and start answering those. Because, like I said, this was kind of this was an overview. I can go into more detail, but if you're like me, you're probably tired, and me talking about this would probably make you more tired. So, uh, any questions? Sorry, you're asking what if you have multiple interviews with people? Um, it has, and I think the main thing is that you focus on the event. If that's the case, it can get pretty wild if. But I know you're going to focus on one single event, so it would be kind of interesting. The harder part is, do you have enough room in the paper to cover both interviews? And then it sort of depends on how good your interviews are. But to answer your question, yes, I think it can be done. It's just a matter of maybe having to make a few choices. That's all. Like you may not be able to use all of it. I don't really know, like whether or not, I don't know how your interviews went and how much material you had, but if you can weave the two together around the historical event, then I would go for it. That is just my thoughts on it. When students have done that in the past, it's usually works out pretty well, actually. But setting up two interviews is a lot harder than setting up one, and so I don't really encourage it unless someone offers to do it, I guess. So since you're offering, I'd go for it, especially on your subject matter. It would be interesting for your subject to get 10 interviews. I mean, not that you should, but if we had lots of money and lots of time, it would be interesting to just go around and ask as many people as we could kind of the same questions about their experience and then pull that all together, and look at a much broader narrative just because it's something that I just, I don't know much about it. It happened before I was born, and I'm talking about the Detroit riots, Aaron, if you're wondering. Um, there's just so much that I don't know about it. And I think a riot is something that you don't really understand until you talk to people who were there. It's one of those things. I guess most things are like that at some level, and it was such a turning point for the city. Like looking back now, we realize how important it was. But in 1970, there'd been riots all over the country. I mean, it was just, there was a riot in every major city and a lot of small cities. So everybody's like, oh, another riot. But then we saw like how it changed the city from that point on, and then and how the city never really recovered from it in so many ways. And so suddenly it's 50 years later, it seems really important, or almost 50 years. Any other questions? Going once. There's only two of you, so. All right. Well, I guess I'll call it good there. If anybody watches this, I do get like viewers after the fact quite a bit. If anybody's watching this after the fact, shoot me an email. If there's a specific subject you guys want that to have a live stream on, like something that is not clear to you or that you'd like more background on, send me an email and let me know. And I will definitely do that for you. If you request something, maybe send along times that are good for you, just so I don't schedule it during a time when you're not around. So, all right, with that, I hear my son screaming, so I probably have to go. I will talk to you soon, hopefully. Let me know if you have any questions.